Thank you. Thank you. So, one of the things I want to point out by the time Jesus gets to this point is we need to remember this is all one continuous span of consciousness. There's no little title break here between. So what was he talking about before these verses? Look at verses 38 through 42. What was kind of the message there? Okay. What was the contrast that he was giving? You have heard this, but I say this. What was he comparing here? Right. So an eye for an eye, you've heard it said, but I tell you, not that. Don't get your vengeance. Don't get your revenge. Don't resist. Be willing to be persecuted. So I kind of put these two together. There's a lot of, I'm sure, I'll get back to it in a second. Let me finish this thought first. We're talking about an eye for an eye, but I say to you, don't resist someone who's trying to, take something of yours. If they strike you, give them the other cheek. If they want your cloak, let them have your tunic as well. If they want you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. This sort of whole bunch of extra work just to suffer a little bit more. And then he says, now I say, love your enemy. There's no way that these two are not connected, because the person who's, you want to get eye for an eye for out of, that's your enemy. And not only do you not do that, but you also need to love that person now. So this is a whole different viewpoint for a lot of people that are probably listening to Jesus at this time. So he says, you have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy here in verse 43. Now, so there's 2 parts there. Love your neighbor, hate your enemy. And so the first part he's referencing here, to love your neighbor, this comes from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, which includes, this commandment of, love your neighbor as yourself. We hear this all the time. We see it all the time. Does anyone know where the hate thy enemy comes from?
Deuteronomy is talking about the groups of people that mistreated Israelites as they were coming out of Egypt.
Okay. So specific to those people, and God says to the Israelites as they go in to conquer the land, wipe them out completely. But do we ever see a command where God says, you must hate your enemy? I don't know of it. I didn't find it. I tried to. So here we have something very interesting here where Jesus, at one point, he is quoting scripture, and then he's also saying, you've also heard it said, hate thy enemy. But that's not actually God's command. This is something that I don't know if they've added along the way, or they've supposed that, I should love my neighbor, so that means I also should hate my enemy. This is not something that God commanded. Did he command certain things for the Israelites to do as they were conquering the land? Absolutely. Wipe out this group of people because they are evil. Wipe out these people because of their idolatry. Don't take their customs. Don't take them as wives. All these things because of their wickedness. But at no point did God say, well, if they're not one of you, you must hate them. They're an enemy. It doesn't say that. Go ahead, Jeff.
There's a lot of psalms that are somewhat troubling. I think they're called imprecatory psalms. One psalm, the psalmist says, I hate those that you hate with perfect hatred.
Mm.
I've often wondered if the word meant something different in that time than it does now. God said, Jacob I loved and Esau I hated. We know that God did not hate Esau. God loved Esau like he loves every person. The word hated did not mean, and you would assume that God used that word in a way that it communicated the right thing to the people who received it. So we know that when the Bible was written, it's always written primarily to the people who received it. And we would understand the meaning of the word in that context. So I've often wondered if perhaps, the use of the word here and in other places, it's not quite how we use the word in our culture today.
And I think maybe also we have a difference in who's making the judgment on this. If I have my enemy, that's my judgment. But the enemy of the Lord is a totally different standard that I cannot hope to match. I better make sure I'm in line with God's standard and not my own personal vendettas or biases, because I think that's what a lot of what was going on, which is why Jesus spends a little bit extra time talking about these kinds of things. So you have people who have this thought process of like, yeah, I love my neighbor, but I'm going to find a way to exclude people from that category, because where do you draw the line? At what point, where's the neighbor, where's the enemy? And you know what? Someone asked Jesus about that. Remember the parable of the Good Samaritan? Who is my neighbor, Jesus? Who is it? And then he goes and tells the story of the Good Samaritan. He says, well, who is his neighbor? Well, the one that acted as a neighbor to him, a Samaritan, who the Jews would have considered enemies, not neighbors. But so this is the point that that Jesus makes, and that's in Luke chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. I won't go through the whole thing of that, since most of us are pretty familiar with that. But if you want to kind of consider that as a nice read along with this, maybe do that in your own study. I think it pairs very well. But if you go back to the Old Testament and you look at some of the verses you'll find there's actually several verses that talk about having a positive, loving conduct toward your enemy. If you go to Exodus 23, we think of Exodus as, they're being told to wipe out such and such groups. But if you go to Exodus 23, verses 4 and 5, it specifically tells the Israelites to help their enemy with their livestock if they see their livestock wandering off or struggling under a heavy load. Your enemy, they're having some sort of issue with their livestock. You don't just say, well, that's their problem. You go and help them. Your enemy. You help your enemy. That would seem like a loving thing to do. Proverbs 25, verses 21 and 22, talk about giving your enemy food and drink if they are hungry or thirsty. And I believe Paul is actually quoting this when you go to Romans chapter 12, verse 20. And he's talking about when your enemy is hungry, feed him. When he's thirsty, give him something to drink. In the context of doing so, all people need to not seek revenge against one another. He says, don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Love your neighbor. Do something good to him. Don't say, well, he's, or to your enemy, he's not my neighbor, he's my enemy, so I'm not going to do good to him. Don't try to draw that line. Love your neighbor and love your enemy. Jeff, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
So you remember what Elisha commanded the king of Samaria, the northern 10 tribes of Israel, king of Israel, to do when the Syrian army was blinded by the angel of God. And he brought them to the capital city and told the king to feed them.
Yeah.
And treat them well. It's kind of an interesting parallel there. I wonder too if we have to be careful about judging people in the past who lived in different circumstances with the current feeling of the culture that we're in. So the Israelites were required to fight, and that's not a little thing. We live in peace, and we don't draw swords, we don't duel, we don't have vigilante justice, we don't draw up those feelings as often as people in Israel would have needed to be the nation God determined they should be. They were to carve out a place in which there were, in theory, no contrary voices. If there were Gentiles, they would be believers. So there would be no contrary voices among the people. That was God's desire, and I know the Israelites did do that. But that requires a frame of mind that's different than ours. And so I just caution myself a lot of times when I think about these things, not to be too harsh on them, because of what was required of them is not something that's required of us.
And I think that's Jesus' point here is you're not being given a directive to go in and take land and wipe out people who God has deemed wicked. Not you in your own personal view, but God has deemed this way. It's not that way anymore. We can actually probably go to a lot of verses that talk about that. Don't want to get too far off that track. But Jesus he's making sort of a radical point here. And I think, well, there's two parts to this. if you go back to chapter 5, verses 17 through 20, where he's talking about he had not come to abolish the law, but come to fulfill it, to bring it to completion, to perfect it. This is the kind of stuff we're talking about. He's not saying, all this law stuff that came before you is no good. It's, here's how you make it better. Here's how you improve upon what God had given to your forefathers, all these years ago and some long time. And here's how you make it better. Here's how you become more like God. And there's probably more I could say about that in just a minute, but I'll not. Arnold, you're having your hand up. I'll get to you before I go on. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm just thinking about, Scripture also tells us that by doing these things, just opposite of what you probably would do, it would cause your enemy to think. It says, heap coals of fire on the heat.
Mm-hmm.
So, in that instance, we see how loving the enemy may endear them to hear you, listen to you, hear the gospel. It's hard to, talk to someone about the gospel if you're fighting.
Right, absolutely.
You have to do it in peace.
Yeah. Who did Jesus hang out with while he was on the earth? Yeah. All the people everyone looked at and say, like, he's sitting down to a meal with that guy? He's entering that guy's house? What was Jesus trying to do? He was trying to save people. He's not going to the people who, in their own minds, they're saying, well, I'm already righteous. I don't need anything else. He's looking for the people who know they are lacking. And he is seeking them out to save them. Let me build upon Arnold's point here, because this is sort of one of the next things I had in my notes. Why are we told to do this? He's already talked about it, is we're going to, heap burning coals on their head. We're going to make them think about stuff. Maybe we can have a conversation with them. But I think the real answer here is in verse 45. If you look at Matthew 5, verse 45, it tells you to do all these things. Why? That you may be sons of your Father in heaven. That's why. That's the answer. Why do you do this? Because you want to be sons of your Father in heaven. And many of these points, Jesus has made or is about to make, they're going to be touched upon also in Luke chapter 6, verses 27 through 36. I'm not going to turn to that, but if you want to kind of look at that and see how that parallels, that's obviously a really good place to look at. But the conclusion of those verses, Jesus is saying, be merciful just as your Father is merciful. If we want to be like Jesus, if we want to be like the Lord, we need to learn to show love to people that may not show it to us. Consider how the Lord showed his love to us. If you look at Colossians chapter 1, verses 21 through 23, or Romans chapter 5, verses 6 through 10, what does it describe people as? Were we good and righteous when Christ showed up? No, we were sinful. We were enemies of God. There's that word, enemies of God. And he loved us. So when Jesus says love your enemy, that's what God has done to us. We need to do the same thing. This is hard. This is difficult. This requires so much love, it is on the standard with God's love. That's what we're striving for. So if that seems like a really difficult thing, it is. But does Jesus say, well, it's too hard for you, don't worry about it? He says, no, be like your Father in heaven. Be like him. This is what Jesus is calling us to. Again, a form of righteousness that is not some sort of self-serving righteousness or an outward appearance, an actual God-centered righteousness like him. And I think it's interesting, maybe perhaps even Jesus was, when he's speaking later in Matthew chapter 25, verse 31 through 46, talking about the separation of the sheep and the goats, and the people say, well, Christ, when did we ever see you hungry or thirsty or needing clothing? Or, the list goes on. He says, what to them? If you did this to the stranger or didn't do it for the stranger, you did or did not do it for me. Again, this is sort of what Jesus is trying to kind of hit us on the head with. Again, kind of referencing back to Proverbs 25, verses 21 and 22. Jesus further warns us against only showing love to those who show love in return. This is sort of the tail end of this section I want to cover. And again, this is also addressed in Luke chapter 6, verses 32 and 34. If you want to take a look at that, obviously it's a great reference as well. But basically, to love for love in return is no love at all. It is merely transactional. It's a social contract. It's not a desire to help one another for the sake of helping one another. It's, I'm going to help this person because I think I'll get something in return for it. There's a lot of that in the world. And in some instances, that's okay. I give you some money, you give me a product or service. That's a transaction. That's perfectly fine. A lot of our economy is based off of that. But if you say, oh, you're in trouble, well, are you going to help me out later when I'm in trouble? No? Okay, I'm not going to help you then. Like, that is a lot of what the mindset was at the time. Jesus is saying, don't be like, you help that person whether they can help you back or not. Whether they're your neighbor, whether they're your enemy, you're going to show love to that person. Again, this is God seeking a pure and loving heart, not the social constructs of opportunity and seeking power. Again, we want to be perfect and complete by following God's example, not whatever ideas we come up with in our societies. Other comments, questions?
We do have to get out of the mindset of seeing other people as rivals. They are not, and they should not be considered rivals. Even though somebody may make themselves an enemy of me, I am not to make myself an enemy of them in return. But there's a lot of people in the world that they will tell you very quickly, I treat other people the way they treat me. And they think that's honorable. So here's and God's illustration, Jesus' illustration is perfect about if you love like the tax collectors and the sinners, then you're no better than them. If you're out picking up trash in the yard, and someone comes up and picks up one little piece of trash and puts it in the yard and says, okay, I'll help. Or there's the other mindset of somebody who stays working and he will not quit working until all the work's done. That's the mindset God wants us to have. The mindset that is all in, that is thinking about God first and not people first, and certainly not me first. But we've got to get it into our minds and rise above this idea that this person I'm talking to, that it's between me and him. It's not. It should not be.
Yeah, it's the JOY acronym. Jesus first, yourself last, others in between. So again, if we want that God, the righteousness that God considers righteousness, not our own, whatever we come up with, it's going to look a lot like what Jesus says and not what Jesus says you've heard it said, or this is what you think this is. We're called to something much higher than that. Any other comments? All right, so that is about 20 minutes of review on something I know you guys already talked about, but I'm glad we got through it all. Let's continue on. Let's get into chapter 6. I think we can do a little bit of this. Let's read, someone read for us Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, please.
Take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men to be seen by them. Otherwise you have no reward from your Father in heaven. Therefore when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have their glory from men. Surely I say to you, they have their reward. But when you do a charitable deed, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that your charitable deed may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will himself reward you openly.
Okay, so we're starting to get into some stuff I said we would talk about. I said that months ago. Now we're going to talk about it. So on this topic, and as well as some other things we're going to see later on this chapter, Jesus warns the people about practicing their, what I'm going to quote, acts of righteousness. That's what my translation actually put quotes around that. He says, be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before men. So even my translator kind of sees something in there about that. Don't do it before men. And he's going to say this for several different topics. Right now we're on the subject of giving to the needy or doing acts of charity, depending on how your translation words that. And this warning is interesting because on the surface, some would say, well, this contradicts what Jesus says earlier in Matthew chapter 5, verse 16, where he says, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Okay, I understand that mindset. That is very superficial, however, because Jesus clearly states here, the issue in Matthew chapter 6, verse 1 is whether or not we're doing it just to be seen. We're not to hide our faith. We're not to withhold from doing good to others, but we don't do them for the purpose of being seen by others and being praised for that. And I think immediately, and I probably referenced this book several times. I need to bring it in maybe one day and just kind of, well, maybe not. I don't know. Plato's Republic. It's one of my favorite philosophy books. Socrates and a man named Glaucon are talking about what a perfectly righteous man and a perfectly unrighteous man would look like. And they come to this conclusion that the perfectly righteous man will do acts of righteous, but no one will have any regard for his righteousness. It will be as if nobody knew he was righteous. And in the end, he will be tortured and impaled, put to death. Kind of like Jesus. It's a very similar description. It's crazy how these Gentiles came up with this idea of how Jesus would die hundreds of years before him, having no idea what Jesus would be about. Just very interesting. But on the other hand, they say a perfectly unrighteous man would do evil. He would do all these bad things, but people he would have this reputation of being righteous. Maybe he would do some outward things that people would see and be like, oh, that guy is so great. Let's praise him for being a righteous person, even though he is absolutely the opposite of that. That kind of sounds like the Pharisees a lot of times, because Jesus is constantly telling them, you guys are hypocrites. You do this or you say this, but you're not really doing the right things. There's many places we go to that. I don't think I have to reference all of them. But this is kind of what we're hitting at here. Your righteousness is not an outward appearance. Your righteousness is what you actually do and say. So, if someone sees you doing something righteous, fine, that's good. But don't be like, hey, look at me. I'm giving this guy $1. Like that's nothing. If you get praised for that you've got all you're going to get. God is not going to glorify you for that. So Jesus, he talks about the hypocrites. They blow their trumpets in the synagogues and in the streets to call attention from the people when they're giving to those in need, to garner honor from the people. I almost think of this as sort of like an ancient form of virtue signaling. Like, can you imagine if you're just walking, let's say you're walking down the street in Columbus, downtown, and a guy on the corner of Broadway and 12th just suddenly starts getting on a megaphone and says, hey, I found someone here who's in need. Watch me help this guy. You'd be like, what's wrong with that dude? Like, what's he trying to prove here? Like, that would seem ridiculous to us. But there are some people who say like, oh, wow, look, he must be a really good guy. I'm really glad I was here to see that. I want to know more. Like, there are people who do get drawn into that. Now, a lot of us, we would immediately see what the problem is here with that because we've read this verse. We know what's going on here. We're not giving because we want to be seen, because we want people to honor us in some way. When we do righteous acts, we do it because it's the right thing to do, because it's what God told us to do, because it's what we want to do, because we want to love our neighbor and our enemy, not because I think I'm going to get something out of it. Again, this is sort of this transactional mindset where I'm going to help this guy because I think I can get something out of it. I'm going to get some benefit, not sacrificing anything, really. Maybe it's more of an investment. That is a totally incorrect mindset. That is not what Jesus was talking about in Matthew chapter 5 when he's talking about being a light to the world so that people can glorify the Father in heaven. It's not for us. If they see it, that should be for God, not for us. So Jesus clearly states, this, and again, before I get to that, maybe some good is done. Maybe, somebody is blaring a trumpet on the street corner and they're giving to somebody. Maybe some good is done in the moment, but it's done with wicked intent. It's obviously building a false sense of justification. Again, perhaps not unlike those who are in Matthew chapter 7, verses 21 through 23. We'll get more to that later, but if you want to kind of glance at what I'm talking about there, you'll probably understand. But Jesus is clearly saying that if you do something considered good for the purposes of being seen and praised by men, you get that. Good job. You've accomplished your goal. You're not getting anything else. You got your praise from men. How does that feel? Feel good? Yeah? Well, that's it. You're not getting anything from God. God is not going to honor people with such hearts. Again, a righteous person is going to help because it's the right thing to do, not because we think we're going to get some benefit, some honor, some clap of the hand. That's not what we're here to do. In fact, if you think about Christians in the early church, they were often not given those praises. They were often put in prison. They were, tortured. All sorts of bad things happened in that time period. They were not doing it because they thought they were going to get something out of it. They were going to sacrifice everything in what they were doing. Comments, questions on this? We'll probably have a lot of similar things to say in the next coming verses. Jeff.
This is something we wrestle with a lot, or should. For a deed to be a charitable deed, a deed that is appropriate, it needs to be a sacrifice. It doesn't need to be, like you said, $1. It needs to be something that, I'm not saying that you give till it hurts necessarily, but it needs to be a sacrifice. Secondly, we wrestle with this idea, this balancing this idea between doing something that others can be encouraged by, inspired by, motivated by, so it would be good that they hear about it, and this idea that we be altruistic ourselves, noble, and not put the spotlight on ourselves. And so a lot of times we use words to say, well, I'm not doing this for me, I'm doing this for this person. Or some other eloquent way that we might phrase it that makes it sound okay. And that's okay. If we do things that are seen, we do need to remind ourselves, don't exalt yourself. Don't think you're great because of it. And this is really hard because it is human nature to do that, to do the very thing God does not want us to do. I would say that one of the things that I've done in my life, this is a judgment, not necessarily right or wrong, is to make sure I do a certain number of things anonymously, and on purpose. I've been in a situation before where you do something anonymous, and then people find out about it, and they say, dude, what's wrong with you? Let's let the people know about it. And, it's just a difference in judgment here, and we have to be able to navigate that in a way that is, we want to try to be comfortable. We don't want to be adversarial with our brother who is encouraging us and commending us in some way. We want to do that, but it is difficult. I struggle with this. I'm sure all of us do to some degree, knowing how to handle these situations. Obviously, one thing we need to remember, we can deceive ourselves. We can tell ourselves that we are noble and selfless when it's just the opposite. So we have to be careful about this and put a certain degree of prayer and effort into making good choices.
Yeah. Trying to think of where the exact verse is, top of my head. I think it's Luke 21. Well, this is also in other Gospels, but this is the one I had in my mind. Luke 21, 1 through 4, Jesus he and his disciples, they're at the temple. There's people giving money to the treasury. You have all these people who are going up, putting in a lot of money, and you see slightly different variations of this in other Gospels. But in Luke chapter 21, verse 4, Jesus said, all these people gave out of their wealth, but then speaking of this poor widow who had, put in just a couple copper coins, says she put in what she had out of her poverty, everything she had to live on. The money actually was smaller, amount-wise, but God saw that as a righteous act. Not these people who were, kind of taking your phrase, not really making a sacrifice, because if you got so much wealth, how much, is this really worth to them? And those are some judgments that we often need to make on our own. I'm not going to tell you need to give this much or that much, because that gets into a whole slippery slope that a lot of denominations have fallen into. not my judgment. That's between you and God for things like that. But these are absolutely things we should think about. Am I doing this because I think this is the right thing to do, because something good is going to happen from this, or do I think I'm going to get some sort of benefit? Or some people give because they feel good when they give. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe you should feel good when you do something that's right. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But if it's like, well, I just want to give so I have that good feeling that I did something good and I'll comfort myself, you kind of get into the territory of, is this self-righteousness? And we do have to be careful about that. That's why I think this is a good topic for us to talk about. The Sermon on the Mount is just as important a message today as it was back then. We have these people given vast amounts in the temple treasury. Okay, but what are they doing the rest of the day? Are they saying, again, I've put my money in there, now I'm good for the week, and I can kind of go and do what I want because I gave X amount? That idea has existed and persisted, unfortunately. Again, some very good thoughts, Jeff. I think did you have a follow-up?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
You mentioned Luke 21, and it's so funny because the container that they put the money in, you didn't have to blow the trumpets. All you have to do is you throw in coins, and if you have a lot of coins, you just throw them real hard against the back of and it makes a lot of noise. Now, of course, obviously someone who wants to be modest and humble can just drop them straight in, whatever amount he gives, and they'll hit the coins down the bottom, they'll make a little bit of noise. This woman's 2 mites would not have made hardly any noise at all. And God is not listening for the noise. He knows the heart. And we need to recognize, don't listen to the noise. Don't listen to the noise of the good deeds you just did. Continue to remain humble in your heart. And one of the best things that has helped me in times past is to, at the time I might do a good deed, I think of the Lord and what the Lord has done for me. Nothing I can do can compare with what He's done for me, and so it helps to keep down the noise of the deed that I just did.
Yeah, I think again, this is a stream of consciousness. What did Jesus just talk to the people about? Loving even your enemies. And now he's talking about giving to the needy. And maybe these needy people are what you would consider your enemies, and you're going to do it because it's the right thing to do, and you're going to do it because it's the right thing to do before the Lord, not because I think, again, I'm going to get something out of it or some sort of superficial benefit of some kind. There's probably a number of things we could come up with. Yeah, very good points. Any other comments on this section here? Okay. You always leave me in this great situation where I've got like 3 minutes and I want to keep going, but I know I need more than 3 minutes. We're going to stop there. We'll continue on. The next couple of things we have coming up are talking about prayer and fasting. And I'll just kind of talk about this sort of a prelude. Jesus is going to have very similar messages about these things as he just had about giving. So it's going to be, you're doing it because this is a righteous act to do, not because you want people to see you doing an act of righteousness and getting praise for it. So we're going to see that in both prayer and fasting. And you're going to say, well, why didn't he just lump these all together? These are basically the same. And yeah, they basically are, but he's going to have slightly different details on them. But it's going to feel very familiar to what we've just talked about this morning. But I do want to cover them. I think there's a couple other things we can add. And a lot of actually, when it comes to the subject itself, I think there's some other verses we can look at that will kind of support what Jesus is saying for that particular topic. So I'm not just going to gloss over them. I am going to sort of deep dive on them a little bit. When we get to the end of chapter 6, verse 18, we're going to kind of shift into, if you remember the beginning of this study, I kind of split this into 4 parts. That'll be the end of part 2. Just checking my notes, make sure I'm not saying these incorrectly, because even I can't remember them. Maybe I should have made them simpler. I'd split it into 4 parts of, even though they're all talking about righteousness, this whole sort of sermon. Part 1, which is Matthew chapter 5, verse 3 through 20, talking about the attributes of the righteousness and Jesus' fulfillment of the law. in part 2, which we're in right now, which is Matthew chapter 5, verse 21 through chapter 6, verse 18, talking about the actions of the righteous, which is a lot of what we're talking about right now. This is all good stuff. But when we get to the end of verse 18, starting in verse 19 of Matthew 6, we get into part 3 that I've called the eternal mindset of righteous. So of the righteous. So when we get into verse 19, he's going to start talking about treasures in heaven, and he's going to talk about a lot of much more high up thinking, not a lot of the day-to-day stuff necessarily, but well, he will a little bit in chapter 6, but he's going to start talking about some of the more eternal things that we need to think about. Instead of, what's happening here that I'm trying to have to constantly cover, what are we doing for our eternity? And he's going to kind of move up the ladder there until you get to chapter 7, verse 6. And then Matthew chapter 7, verse 7 through the end, he's going to talk about perseverance and trials of the righteous. So just kind of reminding you of that frame. We'll probably get through prayer and fasting next week. Whether or not we start talking about the eternal things in Matthew 6, verse 19, we'll see, but I'll be ready for it. So that's where we'll move on from here. So thank you for your time, and we'll continue on next week.